And now I think that's becoming more important to understand. What did we spend to get
Yeah,
the value that we're getting? Were
yeah,
those clicks worth it? Worth the effort? And over what time period do they have to pay back? I think there's a
yeah.
lot of questions that having this data, it makes it easier to have conversations about these questions, but these conversations are hard.
Today's guest is Rebecca Murphey, field CTO at Swarmia and former manager at Stripe and Indeed. Most recently, she's the author of the book Build Elements of an Effective Software Organization. With Rebecca, we talked about her journey through Indeed, Stripe, and Swarmia, and the three pillars of her book: business outcomes, developer productivity, and developer experience. So let's dive right into it. Hey, Rebecca, welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, I'm so glad. I can't believe we set this up so long ago and it's finally happening. So it's
It's
great,
true.
great to be here.
It's true. We set this up on the calendar, I think, like 3 or 4 months ago, and we are finally here and so happy to have the chance to chat with you.
Likewise,
So, Rebecca,
likewise.
you are CTO at Swarmia, which is one of my favorite products, and it's a product that makes engineering teams work better, right? And before that, you had a long history of experiences in tech. You work at Stripe, at Indeed, where you were already taking care of developer productivity. And now you have also written a book, which is called Build, which I have here, by the way, which yeah, I've read it, I loved it, and we will talk about this. And it feels to me like the culmination of a journey in a way, right? So we will talk about this and we'll talk about build, but I would like to start with the journey itself. So what
Yeah.
does this journey look like for you? So how do you get into tech and lessons you have learned at Indeed,
Yeah.
at Stripe, and we'll get to Swarmia eventually.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and the reality is that this developer productivity thing goes way back in my in my history. We can, if we want, take this back to middle school, but probably that's too long a journey. Um, but making processes more efficient for people who have to do those processes has kind of been a fascination of mine, really since like high school, and figuring out how to use computers to make life easier for people. And I've really gravitated toward this, using computers to make life easier for other people using computers,
Yeah,
so specifically software developers. Um, and there's a lot of my, you know, long career that has been somehow related to that. But it was at Indeed that I really got, like, we named it. We gave it a name, and we built. There was an organization that was built around this idea that we could make engineers more effective at Indeed. Um, and I was really, really lucky to be part of that. My boss at the time still looks back and he's like, "That's the best project I ever ran." um, and
nice.
I was really fortunate to be a part of a multi-year journey for Indeed to improve how it delivered software and how much time it took for work to go from pixels to production.
Yeah.
And we were able to make huge, like, kind of amazing gains by really investing in the fact that this required effort. It wasn't just going to happen if
By
we just crossed
itself.
our fingers and told people. Yeah. Um, and then from there, I moved on to Stripe in a role that was very specifically in the developer productivity organization of Stripe, which has existed for quite a while. And my job there was to, so at Indeed, my role, although we didn't know it at the time, but when I was hired, but eventually my role became to create a team focused around front end engineering at Indeed and improving the productivity of people doing front end engineering
Mm.
there. I joined Stripe in November of 2020 or so to take on uh, a sort of similar role, but they had a need to build up a JavaScript infrastructure team, and
Mm.
they didn't really know a lot about what that meant. They just knew they needed
Mm.
one, and so I came in with that experience from Indeed and helped stand up that team, hiring people, and eventually hired a manager to take that team over for me, so I could focus on kind of broader productivity efforts at Stripe. Sorry. Um, and so yeah, it's been there's like the past 9 or 10 years of my career has been really focused on this topic. It used to be very front end focused, but really it's just been focused now on, again, effective software organizations and how you how you make them and how you run them.
Yeah, and I guess that many of the main themes around developer productivity really translate easily across different tech, different stacks. So it doesn't matter that you start with front end and you do something else. I think they're basically very similar problems, whatever technology you use, right?
Yeah, very similar. Although it was interesting at Stripe because the 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 details are very different depending on the technologies that you're working on. And
Mm.
that was something that Stripe had struggled to understand. So as they were trying to focus on JavaScript improvements, they didn't understand their users very well, understand the people who were writing JavaScript very well, and so they often were kind of like chasing the wrong thing. They were chasing something that would move a number, but it wasn't the number that those users wanted moved. And
Yeah.
so I do think I think, yes, it is something you can generalize across technologies as long as you remember to talk to your users because they will tell you what the real challenges are.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And then you joined Swarmia, right?
Yes.
And you're a CTO now there. And what kind of work you're doing at Swarmia?
What do I do at Swarmia? So I joined Swarmia in January of 2023. So I've been
Yeah,
there about a year and a half now, and I joined. My role is strange, and we've eventually landed on this field CTO title. So it's less about me directing internal technology decisions, and more about me talking to users or prospective users, or just the industry as a whole, and understanding what their challenges are, um, and being able to speak to them with technical credibility based on
yeah,
my past experiences, and then bringing that back to product, bringing that back to marketing, bringing that back to sales.
yeah,
So it's almost like a developer relations job, but it's not developers exactly who I tend to be talking to. I tend to be talking to more engineering leaders.
yeah,
So yeah, so my job is to is to you know gather knowledge about what people in this industry need, and
yeah.
then help Swarmia turn that into action.
Yeah, this is so interesting. I mean, it has to be so interesting to get in touch with different companies and find, difference and similarities in problems. And was this something that went into the idea of writing a book about it, about like some common findings?
Yeah, I think that it's always fascinating to talk to people at different companies and hear about the details, but the
Mm.
themes are pretty similar.
Yeah,
And you can have kind of um, I love talking to people who run platform teams, for example,
mm.
because you can, once you've established that you've both done this, there's a lot that is just unspoken. Like
Yeah,
you can skip over because there are some really standard challenges in running a platform team, such as what do we name it, and how do we prove our value. Um, and so yeah, there are both like unique challenges in every company, but also definitely themes that I've seen, that we've seen over the years, that we thought we could kind of encapsulate some advice around, and frameworks around those themes. And so
yeah,
that was the idea behind the book, is to, we saw a lot of companies in this industry, whatever we want to call it, this engineering platform management platform, something, or
yeah,
we saw a lot of competitors in this space who were
mm,
really focused on just kind of one aspect
yeah,
um, of this effectiveness topic, and we really, through our experience, like we knew that you couldn't just focus on productivity. You couldn't just
Yeah.
focus on experience. You couldn't just focus on business outcomes. Those are kind of three pillars that together make an effective organization.
Yeah.
Um, and so, when we started writing the book, we thought we had this all figured out. We just needed to write it down. It actually turned out to be a really great process for us as a company to agree on what we agreed on, and agree
Yeah.
on how we were going to talk about this stuff with customers and just how we would communicate generally.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great story, and I'd love to learn more about the thought process that went into deciding that this has to be a book, right? Because writing a book is a strong commitment, and I wonder whether you see through all the insights that you had gathered, and maybe you were thinking about creating a series of blog posts or whatever, and then you thought, okay, it's too much stuff. We have to make it into a book.
All credit goes to our head of marketing, who, before I showed up, was saying we should write a book someday. We should write a book. Like, this was just sort of like a pet idea of hers, but not something that ever bubbled up to like
Yeah,
actually doing it. Our CEO was the most likely person to do it, and he,
yeah,
before I joined, and he that probably wasn't a good use of time for him to be writing a book instead of being the CEO. Um, and so it was this idea that she had had, that I think in her past experience, she'd seen this sort of thing be powerful from a marketing standpoint.
yeah.
And then at some point, I think we were going to a conference. We were sponsoring a conference in the fall of last year and trying to think about what we would do at our booth. And it's like, wouldn't it be cool if we had a book? If we had a book that we could hand out to
Yeah,
people?
yeah,
And so we took, I don't know, 200, 500, maybe 500 copies to this conference and gave them all away. And like, it was really cool. So it was a great idea on her part, just from a marketing standpoint. But yeah, there was not. It was a very startup-y sort of like, let's try this and see if it works. Um,
yeah,
and thankfully, I enjoy writing, and I'm kind of okay at it. And so it was a huge investment of time, but it was also kind of motivating that we had this deadline of like, this conference is
yeah,
coming, and
yeah,
we're going to try and get this done.
yeah. The deadlines, especially for writing, if you ask me, they're very useful. I mean, I write a weekly newsletter, and if I had not, the commitment to push out something every week, I would be such a
Yes.
perfectionist. I would never publish basically anything. So
Yes.
it really works for me as well.
And we were also able to say, we're just printing 500 of these, and if it's a good idea, it's a good idea,
Yeah,
and if not, it's not. And then since then, we went back and made some pretty major revisions to the book and did another round of printing. So now we're actually very proud of what we've made. Whereas
yeah.
with the conference, it was like, let's see how this goes. But
It was
now
the
I feel like
MVP.
there's exactly. We would only disappoint 500 people at most. Um, and so we did. The printer sent us 5 books that were printed upside down, and we found 4 of them, and we knew that someone
Someone had was around and
hung around with
and
an upside down
and maybe
book.
someone was wondering if this was intentional and it was
Yeah,
some
this was
kind of play. Yes.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, we went up on stage and announced, like, if you have that one, get it. We'll take it back and give you a real one.
It's yeah, it's a special edition in a way.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So let's dive right into it. I mean, I read the book and I loved it, and I loved how you distilled such a clear and simple approach, which is based on 3 principles, right? Which are the business outcomes, developer productivity, and developer experiences. And these are principles of what? Principles for defining an effective software team, an effective software organization. And one of the things that struck me the most, and of course I agree with that, but I think it's not trivial in many contexts, that you start with the business outcomes. And it's actually, I think, maybe even the longest section of the book. I mean, you spend a lot of time on that. And some people might be even surprised then that a book which is about software organizations starts with something that is called business and spends so much time on that. So what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts that went into this?
Yeah, that was not an accident. Number one, there was great debate about what order these should be in, as we were coming up with the outline and stuff. And I was not. At the time, I wasn't really a fan of leading with business outcomes because it's not the thing that people usually are talking about. But I also, one of the things
Yeah,
I really learned at Indeed is that if the work you're doing doesn't impact the business, what are you doing? Like,
yeah, yeah,
this is ultimately capitalism. You are being paid to create value for the company.
yeah,
And if you aren't doing that, then yeah, what are you doing? Like, if there's, and so I think it's actually really frequent. I've talked to a lot of engineers who they don't know what value they're creating for the business. They haven't really asked that question, and nobody has asked them to ask that question. And so they end up in a position where they do the work that they're told to do and
yeah,
don't really understand, did this help us close a giant customer? Did this increase our, click through rate by some, whatever your goals might be as a business? As an engineer, it is really easy to be disconnected from what those goals are, especially in the zero interest rate world, where
yeah,
businesses themselves weren't necessarily asking these questions, let alone the
yeah,
engineers. Um, so yeah, we led with that because I was finally convinced that nothing else matters if you don't, like, if you aren't working on the right things.
yeah,
If you're working on the right things, on the wrong things fast, and you're loving it, that's
yeah.
you've got to have those business outcomes for. You have to have an eye on those business outcomes in order to actually, create value.
Yeah. And is this something, I mean, I'm thinking about your role as a field CTO where you jump in, you talk with companies, and I guess, these conversations start to improve the developer productivity experience. I mean, that's something that Swarmia does. But so have you found that sometimes you have to do this kind of step back to discuss with the companies what the question that you just said? I mean, what are you even doing? What is engineering even doing? So do you find, have you found this kind of siloed situations where engineering is in his own world, and you have to create that kind of common ground around the goals and the role of engineering?
Absolutely. And something that has really changed in the last little while is that the finance department is showing up to a lot more of these conversations. So even if engineering leaders aren't thinking about them, finance is asking, what am I getting for all this money that I'm
Yeah,
spending? Because in most cases, your employees are your number one cost and cloud is your number two cost. Maybe it's flipped, but like these are the top two costs for most any software organization. And so again, in the zero interest rate time, it was like we were just going to hire as many people as we can, and it was even a competitive situation. Like we're going to
yeah,
hire people so other people can't hire them, um, and kind of hoarding talent without necessarily a plan for how that talent was going to be deployed. And that was okay because the numbers kept going in the right direction.
yeah,
But now that employing people is more expensive from a interest rate standpoint, money is not cheap anymore, or not as cheap as it was. Finance is suddenly showing up and asking, like, what you're making me take out a loan at 8 or 10%. What am I going to get for that? And that's a
yeah,
vast oversimplification, but so yeah, there has been, and that was really part of the goal of the book, was to be able to bring it to conversations with various stakeholders at a company and kind of lay out how these things work together. And at the same time, we started to use very, very similar framing in our sales material and in our
yeah.
marketing material. And so that was like it has been a really great tool for educating the market about what's involved in, again,
Yeah.
an effective organization.
Yeah, yeah. This is like a common thread that I'm seeing in many other podcast conversations between people mentioning that the end of the ZERP era and the big tech reducing and all these linear ways of running engineering teams. And I'm curious about your thoughts looking at all this history playing out over the last few years. Do you think the fact that money is not cheap anymore is leading to healthier teams? The fact that they're linear, it's a little bit more closer to the business value, or and that maybe before we were a little bit too overblown, or we are too lean now. I mean, do you think the pendulum will swing in one or the other direction?
I think there's definitely a pendulum that is swinging. One of the things I think we see a lot more is, you know, leaders feeling the pressure, feeling this financial pressure,
Mm,
and turning that focus into we have to ship on time. Like we
yeah,
have to ship what we said. It's really putting a lot more pressure around deadlines and commitments, and I think that's kind of unfortunate because I don't think that's how you solve this problem. I
yeah,
think you solve this problem by making sure that your teams understand the problems that they're solving and have the room to autonomously execute on solving those problems. So, I think a lot of people who never really had to think about the trade-offs of how you spend money now have to think about it, and they're kind of going into a defensive defensive crouch almost. And I think the more enlightened companies are realizing like this is our most valuable resource. The people who work for us are our most valuable resource. We still don't want them to quit because replacing them is still expensive,
yeah.
as a knowledge loss sense. And we still want them to be doing their best work on the right thing. How do we make sure that happens? So I think it's a really interesting moment in the industry where you have leaders who grew up, you know, kind of like me in the 2010 to 2020 era of tech, and they're having to confront questions that they never
Yeah.
had to before.
Yeah, yeah, it's very true. And I think this is also leading to some very interesting conversations about how teams should be structured, how management should work. For example, in your business outcomes chapter, there is a lot of talking about team organization, right? I found
Mm.
many concepts from team topologies as well. So, do you think that organize? I mean, this is kind of a rhetorical questions, but do you think that structuring teams around the right thing and reshuffling people in the right way for communication, for doing engineer work, can have a big impact in how organizations work? Is this something that you have seen firsthand?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of how you structure the organization and um, how your code is structured. Because
Yeah,
there are definitely I learned this term reverse Conway's law that I'd never heard of, but basically the idea that how your code is structured dictates how your organization can be structured if you want your organization to be effective.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and so I think it's the intersection of those two things that's really interesting to me. We can talk about how teams should function, how teams should be broken down, and all that. But I think the intersection of what would be, um, uh, the right organizational approach to get the most work done, and then seeing where your architecture actually prevents that. And I think I definitely saw that at Stripe. Definitely saw it at Indeed. This was one of my greatest accomplishments at Indeed as a manager. So other people did the work. But one of my greatest accomplishments at Indeed was to take a situation where it took, on average, about 3 weeks for a piece of work to go from it started to it's in production.
yeah,
Um, and very cumbersome and manual release processes, very little automated testing. And yet the business kept growing, and more people wanted to contribute to this code base that didn't have automated deployments, didn't have automated testing. Um, and so the team that owned this Monolith, which is the kind of flagship product of Indeed, was spending more and more of their time just doing release management for
Yeah.
work that
Yeah.
other teams wanted to see in the product. Um, and the architecture wasn't built to support that kind of contribution. It was built for, like, there was one team working on this code base, and so our insight there was to bring micro front ends to the table. Not a like super radical concept, but with micro front ends, we were able to let teams build their own little box of the page and deploy their own little box of the page without having to go through the deployment process of the monolith.
Yeah.
And that brought our time from pixels to production down to how fast can you type. um,
Yeah.
because it was like, if once you had something that was ready to go, you just merged it and it went,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
was the end. And so there's a lot of work that went into making that reality, but I definitely saw that that was a case where there was a reasonable team structure, but that team structure just wasn't enabled by the architecture. And I think you
Mm.
had to change the architecture in order to have those teams work effectively.
Yeah.
I don't know that you could have gone with a different team structure that accepted the architecture, because the architecture really wasn't meant for broad contribution.
Yeah, yeah, I love the reverse Conway's law, and I mean, it's one of those things that I never thought about it before reading about it, and then you read it, and it all makes sense when you think about your past experiences, and you think that it can't be any other way, right? Right,
Right,
basically.
right,
Uh, so, and another part of the business side of the book, which I really appreciated, is the focus on understanding where your engineering investment goes, which is one of the topics that I feel it doesn't enter many times in conversation when we talk about engineering metrics, and it's not necessarily one of the things that you discuss when you talk about frameworks. But in my experience, being aware of what are you spending time on is extremely important as step zero to diagnose where what you should do and where you should go. So is this
right.
something that you recommend or something that you work on with companies that you advise even at Swarmia?
Yeah, I think where the most obvious case of this is KTLO, keeping the lights on. How much time are
Yeah,
you spending on that, which has value to the business in that it has existential value to the business,
yeah,
but it takes away from creating new value for the
yeah,
business. And so I think just understanding how much of our time is going to that can be a huge uh, win, because now you can start to put a price on reducing KTLO.
yeah,
Maybe you can spend a quarter writing automated tests, or spend a quarter automating your deployments, or spend a quarter, giving customer success tools that they need so they don't have to bother you.
yeah,
There are lots of levers you can pull to reduce KTLO, but it's hard to know when to pull them if you don't know how much time is actually going into
yeah,
KTLO. So we actually have a blog post I need to work on about this, but um, we kind of recommend that you should always budget for KTLO because it's going to happen.
yeah,
So you can't leave it out. But if you are seeing that take up more than, say, 20 or 30% of a team's time, then you have kind of a crisis that you need to
yeah,
solve. And solving it is going to require a conversation with product and with sales and with other people to explain, like, the reason we aren't producing value as fast as you wish we would is because we have this burden, and
yeah,
eliminating this burden is going to take time, which is going to make us ship even less for a little while. Um, so we talk about the balance framework, which is a name that we gave to a blog post by a former Dropbox VP of engineering. And he basically identifies, like, the key categories are new things, improving things. So new things in the product, improving things in the product, KTLO, and improving the productivity of the team, which is
yeah,
basically like reducing KTLO. So, you know, Swarmia offers kind of a view of those different categories and how much how much work is happening in each of them, and then that hopefully allows conversations to happen across those functions about like what are the trade-offs that we're making. I think the
Yeah.
other thing that we try to educate our customers on um, is the idea. Again, this is such a post-ZERP phenomenon, but the idea that wor- working on something until it's done may not actually be like have the ROI that you want it to have. It
Yeah.
may be that this project is worth doing based on our modeling. This project is worth doing if it takes 3 engineers 3 months, but it's not worth doing if it takes 3 engineers 3 years. Um, and I think that is another thing that wasn't talked about so much in the past for a
Yeah.
variety of reasons. And now I think that's becoming more important to understand. What did we spend to get
Yeah.
um, the value that we're getting? Were
Yeah.
those clicks worth it? Worth the effort? And over what time period do they have to pay back? I think there's a
Yeah.
lot of questions that having this data, it makes it easier to have conversations about these questions, but these conversations are hard.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And do you think, speaking of the balance frameworks and the various categories, that you should proactively budget for those categories? I mean, I understand that, for example, new things versus improvements, it can be something that changes a lot based on your product stage
Mhm.
and various
Right.
things. But for example, when it comes to KTLO and productivity, are there some levels you have talked briefly about this maybe before. Are there some standard levels you should aim for that can give you a broad picture that tells you, okay, this is healthy, this is unhealthy?
Yeah. I do think like KTLO that's more than 30% of the team's work is
Mm,
definitely unhealthy. I want to see that number more in the 10 to 15 range.
yeah,
But one of the things that we say at Swarmia often is the best benchmark is your own baseline. If me saying to you that you should be at 20 and you're at 80 right now,
yeah,
the problem isn't that you're not at 20. The problem is you need to get to 70, and then you can
yes,
get to 60, and then you can burn these things down. So I think it's good to understand where you are and then to set intentions around where you will change and improve. Um, we do publish benchmarks basically to say like this is what good can look like
yeah,
you can get to 10 or 15%. That's a real thing. But I also always want to tell people like it can feel really overwhelming if you're trying to get 80 down to 20,
yeah,
and truly focus on improving continuously, not trying to make some big massive change.
yeah, yeah, makes totally sense. And so we get into the meat probably of the framework that are the two pillars about development, which are development productivity and developer experience. And first of all, I love that you separate those because I think that there is such a confusion when we talk about these things, and a lot of divisive and controversial takes do exist because people are not even on the same page about
Mm-hmm.
definitions. What is what. So, starting with developer productivity, I would love to set the record straight. So, what is developer productivity for you,
What
and how
is
do you
developer
measure?
productivity?
Yeah,
Yeah. So this isn't a great, and we talk about this every day, and I still don't have like a neat and tidy thing to tell you. But um, developer productivity to me is understanding how work is moving through a system. So understanding like, given that this task was started, how long did it take to finish it? Did it get finished? Did it
yeah,
cause a production incident? So really looking at like how is work moving through the process and what are the impacts of that. So I think of developer productivity as something that is it's a risky thing to say because it is we can put numbers around it pretty
yeah,
easily around how work is moving through the system. We cannot associate those numbers with individuals and then fire them. Like that's the
That's the
catch.
baseline that we should all
Yeah.
agree on. Yeah.
Yes. And so I think that, rightly so, especially in the current environment, engineers can get a little freaked out when we start to talk
Yeah.
about putting numbers around these things, because we've seen companies use them to target, individuals. And we saw
Yeah.
a customer who did not end up being a customer. They went with another solution, and then a month later, they used that solution to make layoffs. And part of that was because that solution is very focused on metrics and not focused on kind of the whole complexity of what it actually takes to have an effective engineering
Yeah.
organization. So yeah, I think that's how I think about developer productivity, is that it's about observing how work is moving through the process and the steps that it has to take in order to get from a ticket into production,
Yeah.
and in production at acceptable quality
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. I think this is 100% reasonable, and we should never have like an argument about this being valuable or not, right? When you think about developer process as a system that has inputs and outputs, the idea that you can put numbers into all the steps and trying to improve should never be something divisive. My feeling is that maybe by calling that productivity, some people attach some personal, thing
Yep.
to that meaning, to that term, think that it is associated to their own value, and
Mhm.
so, and even on a second order level, there are managers who might think, okay, I can evaluate people on that, right? As instead as keeping at the system thinking level.
Yeah. If people would search Google for SDLC
Yeah.
management or something like that, then yeah, I totally agree that this is not, like, in the words developer productivity is the word developer, like it's focusing on a single person.
Yeah.
And I really think like it is SDLC, software development lifecycle effectiveness. It's not about like the
Yeah.
developer, especially because so many things go into, once you pick up a ticket, like, do you have to talk to security? Do you have to get an API review? Do you have to
Yes.
like coordinate with another team to make sure you don't break stuff? Do you have to, work with the go-to-market team to actually like make sure there's content that is ready when the thing ships? So yeah, I think like the word developer productivity is really problematic, and it's the word that we're kind of stuck with. Um, and if I had a magic wand, I might use it to fix that.
Yeah.
But it's sort of become the term of art alongside developer experience.
Yeah. And do you think, I mean, being the development process such a complex system anyway, that there are, many numbers you can measure, many things that you can tweak. Do you think you should take these numbers and set goals around them? The saying that goes, when a metric becomes a goal, stops being a good metric. So
Right.
I don't want to get into, DORA and frameworks again, etc.
Yeah, yeah.
But do you think there is a good way to use these numbers for good and work towards some goals of improvement without making it unhealthy or making people game the system or whatever people are afraid of?
I think that good productivity metrics are, one of the classic, classic arguments is, well, if we start to, if we tell people that they should, you know deploy more often, then they're just going to write smaller pull requests. Like,
Yes.
and what's your problem with that? um,
And
because
then,
like queuing theory tells us that if you have like a set of consistently sized small tasks, they can be processed more effectively than inconsistently sized large tasks. Um, that's just math. And
yes.
so, I think that there are some cases where, like, game away. If you're going to write a 2-line pull request that gets some value out into the world, bring it, right? Like,
Yeah.
put a feature flag on it, and do it 10 more times and then ship it. And you, by doing so, you've like dramatically reduced the risk of shipping the change as a whole if you shipped it in these tiny parts and deployed it again behind a feature flag or something like that. So
Yeah.
I do think that these metrics are useful. And again, just like I said with the investment balance, the you know the best benchmark is your own baseline and continuous improvement.
Yeah.
A benchmark will tell you that great teams deploy software multiple times a day. If you're deploying it once a month, then your goal is to get to once a week. Just start there and start talking about like what would that take. And so I think that these metrics are useful in that they help you kind of evaluate whether the things you're trying are working, right? Like you want to
Yeah.
know, are we actually making this process better? And in order to do that, you have to measure it. Yes, you can ask people, is the process better than it used to be? And that is a signal. Um, but you can't ask them every day if it's getting better. And so having metrics that you can use to be tracking progress toward a goal, I think is super valuable. Um,
Yeah.
and the onus is on the company putting these metrics in place to use them for the right reasons.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's the tough part. These metrics are great and valuable if they are used in non-toxic ways.
Yeah. And when you say non-toxic ways versus toxic ways, you're going back to the idea of using them for measuring individual performance and
Mm-hmm.
getting to conclusions that you shouldn't get to, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. Or even like we are definitely hear people saying we want to know like when did we how well are we keeping our sprint commitments, and we
Yeah.
want to target the teams that aren't keeping their sprint commitments. And it's like, well, why aren't they making their sprint commitments? Like, what's going on there? Did they commit because sales told them they had to because this feature has to be ready by Jan 1st? Like, so I think there are lots of ways to do this wrong. And again, we haven't really over the last 10 years, 10 or 15 years, had a lot of incentive to do it right or to learn
Yeah.
about these trade-offs. And that's, I think, what we're seeing happen now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is kind of an aside, but why do you think, you mentioned sprint commitments, you mentioned, I mean, we could have similar conversations about
Mhm.
many things that are, very divisive, all agile processes, etc. So you've worked and seen so many companies. Why do you think we haven't got to some kind of consensus about how even small teams, I'm not talking about big organizations, but should work on their developer process on a weekly basis or in short cycles? I mean, do you
Yeah.
think uh, do we work all that differently that we cannot find really some common ground and different teams should find their way of working or or what? I don't want to drag you into
No.
into this.
Sorry, I was staring off into space as you were asking this question because, yeah, what's so hard about this? Like,
Yeah,
we know what works. There's like math that tells us what works. And I think it's because people are people. People are
mm,
people, and there's money involved, and there's egos involved, and there's um, hierarchies involved, and all these things. And so, even though yes, I do believe that this is actually like it's not easy, but it's straightforward how a healthy team should operate. But what gets in the way of teams operating that way is you know leaders who aren't educated in
mm,
how their decisions are impacting people, and engineers who have never had a chance to experience what good looks like, and they
yeah,
just think that this is just how it is, and they don't have agency, and in some cases they may not have agency to say we're doing it wrong.
yeah,
The classic is we should write automated tests, and it's like yeah, we can do that after the feature ships.
yeah,
um, so I think that and it's so wonderful that so many people have been able to participate in tech and make careers out of tech. And again, there was a period of time where we didn't need to learn these things, and so we're learning them now. And I think that's going to take a few years. So like the I love to say that like the CFO at Stripe while I was there was literally a CFO at a car manufacturer before. Like if you want a more classic example of like you had a person who thinks that this should work like an assembly line. And she was brilliant. She was great. Like nothing against her, but it was just really because she brought that model of thinking to her job, and it's not the correct model of thinking because you make a car, you get paid for it. The end. You make software, it creates value potentially indefinitely. And so the model of an assembly line just really falls apart very quickly. So, but you got a lot of business people who have learned about assembly lines, and that kind of way of making money. So, I think it's a maturity thing and it's a access thing where I think
Yeah.
again in that sort of period, everybody had access to working in tech, which was great
Yeah.
for me. Like, thank God I had access to working in tech. But everybody had access to working in tech, and not everybody came with an understanding of how tech actually works.
Yeah. Do you think that you mentioned this assembly line thinking, like these rules and process thinking? Do you think that this sneaks into tech when instead we could do things simpler? I mean, there are many things. I mean, when you think about mistakes that teams made, engineering teams made, that that they shoot themselves in the foot, it is more on the side of doing too many complicated things in terms of process rather than
Yeah.
not doing something.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that really can come to bite larger companies where there was a process that made sense at a time, and then the process is still in place, and it doesn't work for the current shape of the organization the way that it used to. Um, yeah, I think. Uh, Sorry, say the question again because I like half answered it and half didn't.
No problem. No, I don't even know if that made sense as a question because you mentioned you men- I love the analogy with assembly lines and the fact that maybe we are trying to bring into tech, into engineering, models that are too strict, too based on process, too based on rules than we really need. So I was wondering whether your opinion is that when you look at teams that do things that you don't think are the optimal way of doing things, they are more on the side of making too strict processes rather than being too loose.
I think that's definitely one failure mode. Is to think that the classic thing is like the pull request checklist. We'll just make a checklist on pull requests, and then and we won't release any bugs anymore. Um, and I've been that person who who says that and tries to target these very specific things that have gone wrong rather than looking at the process that led to them going wrong.
Yeah.
You can't fix a process with a checklist at the end of the process. Um, so as I've gotten more mature in my own understanding of this, really looking at what are the human interactions that had made this difficult? Was this like how did we decide that we should be working on this, and who made that decision? And were engineers involved in that decision, and did those engineers understand the business outcomes? So I think that it it is important to understand really like the process that led to the problem and not just add more process to try and make the problem go away.
Yeah.
And I say about development ecosystems that if developers are writing code and shipping it, you have a development ecosystem. You have a product, an internal product that is a development ecosystem, and you better have somebody who owns that product because it's going to
Sure.
evolve on its own otherwise. And the same with process. Like if you have a process for how work gets done in the business, somebody needs to be accountable for that process and how it's impacting,
Yeah.
these different things. So, um, you when you introduce a new, like there needs to be an API design review, requirement into the process, somebody's got to be accountable for how that is impacting the delivery of the teams.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, it's just you yell at the teams about why aren't you going faster. So I do think that there's, if you've read, and I'm sure you have read, the Phoenix Project, there are good things to learn from assembly lines,
Yeah.
and to learn from manufacturing. You can't apply it
Yeah.
directly, but I
Yeah.
think there are things to learn about. You wouldn't add a new step on the assembly line without
Yeah.
calculating like
Yeah.
what risk that was introducing, what delay that was introducing, etc.
Yeah.
So same thing here. Like that has to be, somebody has to be accountable for that.
Yeah, love that, and I love the analogy with the Phoenix Project, one of my favorite books.
Yeah.
So we have talked about developer productivity. Actually, we've talked about many things, but we started with developer productivity, and then you have the last pillar of the effective organizations, that is developer experience, right?
Mm.
So the first basic question again is, how is this even different from developer productivity, right? Because
Yeah.
it's not trivial to many.
Yeah. Um, they are deeply entwined, and but what I think when I think about developer experience, I think about things that are harder to quantify with machines. Um, so, and that's not to say you can't quantify them with machines, but it's harder to quantify than like how many lines of code did we ship. Never quantify that. It's a terrible thing to measure,
By the
but
way, yes.
but it's really easy. Um, so I think developer experience captures the things that are a little bit more difficult to observe in an automated way.
Yeah.
So that is anything from just straight up sentiment, like how do you feel about your job today, um, down to like asking questions like what makes it hard for you to do your work. And this was something that we did once I moved on from the front end team at Stripe. We started this project called Paper Cuts, where people could just click a button and tell us like what was making their day hard today. Um, and the insights that you got from that were, yeah, computers, tools, but also people and process.
Yeah.
And this tool was built against a spec, but they never talked to their users, and so they didn't understand what their users
Yeah.
needed. So I think developer experience can be sort of an input to what should we fix, and when we fixed it, developer productivity metrics should show that we did.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
but but again, with experience, we can't. Um, there are things that we can do to get computers to help us collect the information, like paper cuts or whatever. Or another thing we did at Stripe was time waiting on machines. Just every
Yeah.
tool that did a thing had to emit metrics to the service about like who was trying to do the thing, did it work, did it fail, how long did it take, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So with that, we were able to start to measure experience things
Yeah.
like how long are people waiting for builds? Are people? We found like this one person who their builds were always taking like 2 hours, and the head of developer productivity, the tech lead of developer productivity was like, "That is not possible. Show me like that is like how is that happening?" It turns out that that one person had to do a thing very often that triggered like this pathological worst case in the
Yeah.
build. Um, and so yeah, I think of developer experience as just the part of all of this where you learn things that you can observe, so that then you can figure out how to observe them, and how to set goals around them.
Yeah, I love this story about this specific developer because it reminds me, of how it doesn't make sense for many things to measure, the average. Like for infrastructure, you have to
Yeah,
measure like the P99, and and so there is the P99 of developer experience where maybe you look at developer productivity and everything is fine on average, things look good, but then there are some people who hate it for
yeah.
whatever reason, and you have to take care of that. So they're intertwined, as you said at the beginning, but they can also be orthogonal in some things.
Hmm. Hmm. It, I think about this very much like I think about the difference between front end and back end development. In front end development, P99 might not actually be what you want to be looking for because you're like ultimately running code on somebody else's machine,
Yeah, yeah,
and somebody else's network. And so, like, P99 is gonna be bad,
yeah. Always,
because
whatever.
you don't control the environment. And so even there, I would look more at the P80. I think same thing with developer productivity and developer experience. You want to know what the P99 is, but you may not want to, and you might want to resolve like pathological cases, but somebody's always going to be doing something weird. Um, and just making sure that 80% of your people are having a good experience is better than, if you go after the average, you're definitely going to go after the wrong thing. So
Yeah,
having like, I really like to look at P80 both for front end and for developer experience and developer productivity, because it acknowledges that you're never going to have perfect control over what someone is trying to do.
yeah,
um, and sometimes that build's going to take 2 hours, and like that may or may not be a problem worth fixing.
yeah, yeah. These are wise words. Yeah, I think it's similar to what you said before when when you said, okay, you know the benchmark is shipping multiple times a day, but you're shipping once a week. Let's start by shipping once a day, right? And
Yes.
so it's like
Yes.
saying before you look at P99, let's look at P80,
Yeah.
and then we take one
Yes.
step at a time. So and
Yes.
I have
Yeah.
I have a final question. So while you have written build, and has the whole process prompted some conversation even inside Swarmia? Maybe you figure out things that changed how you do some things in engineering teams in Swarmia as well.
Yeah, actually, like we recently, and there'll be a blog post about this soon. I'm not writing it, so I don't know all the details of it. But we actually used these principles and used Swarmia to address some cycle time issues that we were having at Swarmia, where things were running longer than we knew was healthy. Um, and so we definitely, like, we use Swarmia at Swarmia, and we absolutely use these principles to talk about how we are investing our um, finite resources, and uh, definitely like use tools within Swarmia like the work log to see, like, again, how is work moving through the system, what's blocked, what's been uh, hanging out for too long, what's what's being worked on in a silo, um, and
Yeah,
not with collaboration. So we use Swarmia to build Swarmia, and I think that the book has really clarified. Just it's given us a vocabulary,
yeah,
like a shared vocabulary, and that that's huge because we when I showed up, we like, is this developer experience? Is this developer productivity? Is this like engineering effectiveness? Like, what do we? And we went around and around and around, and like,
yeah,
how? Because
yeah.
like you have to answer these questions to write a LinkedIn post. Like, what
Yes,
words
it's
am I
true.
going to use?
Yeah, I love
Um,
this answer because,
yeah.
I mean, even if it's such a smaller scale, it's similar. It's the same for me when I write a newsletter article because many people think that writing is this thing where you have things in your head, you just put them on paper, formalize them, and it's done. While instead, it's really, I mean, when you write, you clarify things in your head. Things get clear. So writing is thinking in a way.
Mhm.
So I guess that maybe you started with in some parts with some rough sketches, rough ideas about things, and then you figured things out while writing. And I love the idea of having a shared vocabulary about many things that maybe you didn't have before.
Yeah. And I also want to say, like, the not just the process of writing, but the process of having other people read it, which was
Yeah,
agonizing. I sent it to my old boss at Indeed, and he gave some really really great feedback that on just ways I had said things or ways that I was thinking about things, and it was so great to have input from somebody who's actually lived through this kind of project
yeah,
successfully.
yeah, yeah. No, it's very true. It's very true. Feedback really
Yeah.
unlocks some things that we all have our own biases. I mean, so we have blind spots, and I try to do that as well with the newsletter, but writing weekly, it's very hard to,
It's
it is
harder.
one of the things that I want to improve that on.
Yeah, again, it was so agonizing to click that button and be like, "Fly, little bird, fly."
Yeah, you're not
um,
encouraging me at doing and asking for me more feedback, but yeah, I will do anyway.
yes, yeah, it is good in the end.
Yeah. So Rebecca, thank you so much for this chat. I loved it, and thank you again for spending the time and being here with us today.
Yeah, likewise. I could talk about this for hours. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. If you found this chat valuable, you can subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find the show. You can find all past episodes and learn more about the show at refactoring.fm. See you in the next episode.